Good morning, everyone. Our speaker today is Thielmann, who has over 30 years' experience in the executive and legislative branches of government, foreign service, and also working for the Senate Intelligence Committee. Currently, he's a board member of the Association of Arms Control Association.
Also known as the Affordable Care Act, the American Chiropractic
With the abbreviations there. Okay, so without further ado, I introduce Greg.
Thank you, Shirley. I wanted to begin with a little bit of information about my service before government service. My personal journey started in the Great Plains state of Iowa. I grew up some 30 miles east of Des Moines on Interstate 80 in a town that identified itself as the home of Maytag. There were no mountains visible on my horizon growing up. The Rockies were a day's drive heading west, but in lieu of mountains, we had beautiful cloud formations. Sure, when it dawned on me, probably in the early 1960s, that in the event of a nuclear war, I would have had a good view looking straight west at mushroom-shaped clouds rising over Offutt Air Force Base, the headquarters of the Strategic Air Command in Omaha. I probably wouldn't have died immediately from the blast effect, but prevailing winds would probably have brought deadly fallout to our door. I certainly remember the Cuban Missile Crisis in my 12th year of life, but I had no idea until much later how close the world came to catastrophe, all the ways it could have happened. In fact, I just learned a few weeks ago that the Christmas song, "Do You Hear What I Hear," was inspired by the Cuban Missile Crisis. A star dancing in the night with a tail as big as a kite. Who knew this was another product of our nuclear age? I'd now like to highlight a couple of incidents in the course of my career that have relevance to our current crisis over Ukraine. My first assignment abroad was consular section chief of the U.S. Embassy in Brazil in 1977. Sometime after rotating into the political section, I held a party in my Brasilia apartment for embassy colleagues and some of my foreign contacts. Among others, the attendees included my counterpart Valentin in the Soviet embassy, from whom I had routinely received requests for the transit visas needed by Soviet diplomats going through New York City on their way back to Moscow. And relevant to that, I might ask Teresa just to show a picture I'm passing around of this party. As I said, I included my good friends and colleagues, including U.S. Assistant Agricultural Attaché and his Ukrainian-American wife, Natalie. As guests danced to Brazilian and American music, I was feeling good about the event, when all of a sudden, shouting broke out on the dance floor. Natalie, who had apparently just been introduced to Valentin, was screaming, "Your government murdered my grandparents." This incident was my visceral introduction to Holodomor, the Stalin-era famine in the Soviet grain belt, which killed millions of Ukrainians from 1932 to 1933. The middle portion of my career was dominated by the negotiations and implementation of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. I worked at the State Department, 3 years in our embassy to Germany, and 2 years in Embassy Moscow's political section, carrying the U.S.-Soviet arms control portfolio. Two highlights from those days have special relevance for my commentary on this morning's topic. My in-country travel took me to the Belarusian city of Gomel, downwind from the Chernobyl reactor in Ukraine, to a chemical weapons destruction facility near the Ekaterinburg, where Linda Lacey lived for a year, and to the Crimean Peninsula. The latter trip included a visit to the Soviet Black Sea Fleet home port of Sevastopol. No American had set foot in this closed city for 33 years. But as a member of a small delegation from our embassy, I got to witness the visit there of two U.S. Sixth Fleet warships. After their arrival, the streets of the city were soon filled with several hundred American sailors in their dazzling white uniforms. This port call was very friendly, one of the best ever, according to one of the American sailors I spoke with. One haunting memory from this Crimea visit was the docking of the U.S. warships next to a large, formidable-looking Soviet missile cruiser, the Slava. I recently learned that the name of that Soviet warship was later changed to Moskva. This flagship of Russia's Black Sea Fleet now lies at the bottom of that sea, sunk by a Ukrainian missile attack last April. Its heavy armament included 16 supersonic anti-shipping cruise missiles, which, according to open literature, can be armed with 350 kiloton yield nuclear warheads. It seems likely to me that a few such warheads were on board when the ship burned and sank. So personal anecdotes aside, I'd like to now share some of the tentative conclusions I've reached on the subject of nuclear arms control. It's been 77 years since the United States first employed nuclear weapons in war. The threat of such weapons would be used, the threat that such weapons would be used again has been in the background of world history ever since. The U.S. nuclear monopoly lasted only 4 years. First the Soviet Union, and then eventually 7 other countries developed, tested, and deployed nuclear weapons. There are now some 14,000 nuclear warheads in the world's arsenals and nearly 3,800 in active nuclear inventories. More than 90% are held by the U.S. and Russia. I'm also going to be passing around another graphic which shows the situation in 2012. There are less U.S. and Russian nuclear warheads now than there were, and there are more nuclear warheads of other countries than there were then. International conflicts have occasionally brought their potential use to the forefront. Never were there more close calls than during those 13 days of October of 1962. But the Cuban Missile Crisis was not the first time we came close to nuclear war, and it wouldn't be the last.
Greg, can you speak out a little bit more? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, sorry.
Oh, okay. I will try to project a little more. The chairman of the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff recommended the use of nuclear bombs to prevent a French defeat at the Dien Phu in 1954. The U.S. Air Force was prepared to use nuclear weapons against China in the 1958 Taiwan Strait crisis. Nuclear war scares continued into the 1980s, fueled in part by reckless rhetoric, technological malfunctions, and intelligence failures. Even after the end of the Cold War, those calls continued to happen. In 1995, Russian early warning crews detected what they thought was a U.S. ski-launched ballistic missile launch from the North Atlantic. This was the very scenario Russian military planners had postulated for an American first strike nuclear attack. A short warning launch from a submarine of a Trident II missile, whose high altitude detonation would then disrupt Russian communications through an electromagnetic pulse. When the launch was immediately reported to President Yeltsin, the Russian leader was skeptical of this information, and he was sober. He denied the requested authorization for immediate response. A few minutes later, the launch was correctly identified as a Norwegian sounding rocket headed away from Russia. This had actually been notified to the Russians a week in advance that it was going to happen. The broad outlines of U.S. and Russian doctrine regarding nuclear weapons use have not changed very much since rough parity was achieved by the two countries during the 1970s. Nuclear arms are weapons of last resort, used principally to deter war rather than to fight it. Furthermore, the U.S. and the Soviet Union / Russia have on multiple occasions since 1987 declared that, quote, nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought, unquote. Moreover, since the US and 4 other nuclear weapon states ratified the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty some 50 years ago, we have been formally committed to, quote, good faith negotiations leading to cessation of the arms race at an early date and to nuclear disarmament, unquote. Such treaties and the consultative groups that they have generated have until recently curbed the most acute threats of nuclear war. Throughout the Cold War, US nuclear doctrine included the option of being the first to use nuclear weapons in a conflict. Retaining this option was always considered a way to make US nuclear deterrence more credible. It was considered necessary to counteract the numerical superiority of Soviet forces in Central Europe and to allow increasingly vulnerable US ICBMs to escape destruction through a launch on warning option. During the last 3 decades, the US retained the first use option, mostly to reassure new US allies like the Baltic republics that Russia would not be able to successfully exploit these states' vulnerabilities through intimidation or conventional aggression. Ironically, Russia has lately leaned more heavily on preserving the option of being the first to use nuclear weapons because of the growing imbalance between NATO and Russian conventional forces, this time in the favor of the West. In the post-Cold War era, the administrations began giving increasing consideration to adopting a doctrine which would declare that deterrence or defense against nuclear attack was the sole purpose of US nuclear weapons. Vice President Biden declared in a 2017 speech that the president and I strongly believe we have made enough progress toward creating the conditions for the sole purpose doctrine. The administration of Donald Trump, however, signaled movement in the opposite direction, explicitly warning that the US would consider employing a nuclear weapon in response to a non-nuclear strategic attack, and introducing several new and more usable nuclear weapons into the US nuclear arsenal. Biden continued to promote the sole purpose nuclear doctrine in his 2020 campaign for president. But at the present time, just into the 3rd year of his administration, Biden has maintained the option of being the first to use nuclear weapons, even in response to non-nuclear attacks. The publicly released doctrinal policy is that, quote, we would only consider the first use of nuclear weapons in extreme circumstances. So I will repeat that because it's an unbelievable statement. We'd only consider the first use of nuclear weapons in extreme circumstances to defend the vital interests of the United States or its allies and partners. So this kind of implies that we would be willing to use nuclear weapons to defend, let's say, Saudi Arabia against a conventional attack. Biden's defense budget has also included an increase in nuclear spending over that of his predecessor, making it difficult to argue that he was implementing his campaign pledge to decrease the role of nuclear weapons. It has not helped international non-proliferation goals that nuclear Russia has invaded and terrorized non-nuclear Ukraine. Washington's failure to adjust its doctrine to the post-Cold War world has blurred Putin's own departure from Moscow's 3-decade-long pledge to only utilize nuclear weapons if the very existence of the nation were threatened. Putin's ominous threats after invading Ukraine were made initially to prevent other countries from coming to Kyiv's aid, and later to compensate for Russia's military failures. Despite Biden's efforts to avoid direct confrontation between the 2 nuclear powers, Putin implied in October that Moscow's nuclear weapons would be used to defend occupied regions of Ukraine that he claimed as Russian territory. As what I would describe as an impatient but incrementalist arms controller, I'll offer my vision of next steps to be taken on a long road toward achieving nuclear disarmament. Building on the New START treaty is a vital priority. This treaty, which will expire in 2026, limits both sides to 1,550 deployed warheads on 700 delivery vehicles. It also includes mutual obligations to host on-site instructions and provide data on testing and on deployment locations. The size of the US and Russian arsenals must be significantly reduced in a follow-on agreement, and negotiations urgently need to be resumed. The war in Ukraine demonstrates that existing forces are far in excess of any requirements for effective deterrence, and therefore are both wasteful and counterproductive. In the lingo of the trade, there's an argument that Ukraine not only is bad news in terms of horizontal escalation, but it's good news in terms of vertical escalation, because the utility of this massive nuclear weapons arsenal that the US and Russia has basically no relevance to Ukraine. Moreover, recent studies suggest that the Earth's climate and economic structure are far more vulnerable to the lasting damage of a nuclear war, even among non-belligerent states. The latest calculation of fatalities from a full-scale US-Russian nuclear exchange, 5 of the 8 billion inhabitants of our planet. In this apocalyptic scenario, the long-term prospects of cockroaches would be more favorable than that of Homo sapiens. Expanding the scope of nuclear arms control to include sub-strategic weapons is a significant objective for Washington. It is not too late to revive the INF Treaty, which eliminated an entire class of nuclear-capable weapons, and to add nuclear-armed sea-launched cruise missiles to the ban. For Moscow, including limits on strategic defenses and on high-precision conventional weapons with strategic impact are high priorities. Given the prudent worst-case threat analysis of national security establishments on both sides, ways must be found to include limits on strategic missile defenses, in addition to those on offensive weapons. And the final category of unfinished arms control I'd like to raise is the ban on the explosive testing of nuclear weapons. The 1996 Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, now signed by 196 countries, was an enormous step toward nuclear disarmament. It was the culmination of a 35-year negotiating process, which began when near weekly atmospheric testing was introducing radioactive isotopes into mother's milk throughout the Northern Hemisphere. The means of verifying a ban on testing has made enormous progress, and the international pressure to abide by its terms has been significantly enhanced. US views prevailed in shaping the treaty, but sadly, the US Senate refused to ratify it. So now 8 more countries have to ratify the treaty before it enters into effect. 6 of those countries are nuclear weapon states, but 2, China and the US, have already signed the treaty. And only 1, North Korea, has tested nuclear weapons during the last quarter century. I do not believe that denuclearizing the Korean Peninsula is a near-term option, but there may be a deal to be made with Pyongyang on halting nuclear testing. So I'll conclude by mentioning 2 additional steps we should take as soon as possible to avoid nuclear war. The US needs to ensure that the decision to use nuclear weapons does not reside with a single individual, particularly since the power to declare war supposedly resides with the Congress under our Constitution. Potential candidates for adding additional nuclear release authority include the Speaker of the House, the Majority Leader in the Senate, and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Such an addition would provide the US military with the legal authority it needs to stand in the way of a deranged president intent on starting a nuclear war for his or her own political benefits. I don't know if you can imagine a deranged US president, but I think we all can come a little closer to that than previously. The US also needs to eliminate the most threatening and most unstable leg of the triad: 400 intercontinental ballistic missiles based in vulnerable silos, which must be fired in minutes after detecting an incoming first strike in order to survive. all important targets can be covered with a dyad of submarine launched ballistic missile and strategic bombers with air-to-ground missiles. We should not confuse the triad with the Trinity, which should be left to the sphere of religion. So thanks for listening. I'll be glad to take questions.
We'll start with questions from the people who are here and present, and Greg will repeat any questions so that I hope it comes through on the microphone to people on Zoom. And people on Zoom, if you would put questions in chat, or if you want to ask a question verbally, put your name into chat and we'll call on you next. So questions here from people at Dunbarton.
I will ask the question that you've heard me ask.
Let me say, Howard, because would you come over here, and then I think the question may also be heard, or comments that you have, if you'll stand behind us here. Okay, thank you. Go ahead.
I will ask the question that you have heard me ask every time we've been to a meeting on this subject. Can you describe a situation in which the use of a nuclear, which would be improved by the use of a nuclear weapon?
I've heard this Howard ask questions like this numerous times, and it makes the prominent speakers very uncomfortable because they can't answer this question. And I would also express difficulty answering this question with the sort of cop-out answer in the way that it's partly a question of will the other side risk the chance that the U.S. would not respond. So we're getting into a very speculative realm that I think that quotation that I used about a nuclear war cannot be won, must never be fought, kind of addresses this question. No, we can't really imagine any situation that will be improved by the nuclear weapon. And so that raises the question, well, why should we have nuclear deterrence at all if that's the case? And that gets to a very difficult discussion about whether or not countries are more secure if they have a no first use posture, but that they're saying that if you attack us with nuclear weapons, we will not guarantee a non-nuclear response. Now that's a little convoluted, but that's about as close as I can get to answering the question, Howard. But it's still kind of a dodge.
I have a question. As far as I know, the United States is the only country in the world who ever used nuclear weapons. And
Can't hear you.
many
And take
people.
your mask off, please.
Yes, sorry. So why would we think that the world believes America that should be the leader in deterrence of not using nuclear weapons, when it was the only country who did this? Nobody else before had ever done this. I think Germany was capable, but not as far as the Americans. So I was thinking about that a lot. Out of fear, because what happened, or why would America be the leader in order to deter the world to use that? And my other question is, you heard or you know that Israel has the atomic bomb. Almost everyone in Europe believes that is the truth, but it's not, I think, documented anywhere. Thank you.
So Ursula raised two questions. I'll address the second one first, and that is about the status of Israel. Israel neither confirms nor denies that it has nuclear weapons, but it's pretty obvious that Israel has nuclear weapons, and it has a lot of nuclear weapons. It has more than North Korea. Certainly has. Iran has no nuclear weapons yet, and it's very annoying that the U.S. Often acts as if Israel does not have nuclear weapons in I mean, you get the impression from the US rhetoric that we're trying very hard to make sure that weapons are not introduced into the Middle East. Well, sorry, that horse left the barn a long time ago, and Israel has a lot of nuclear weapons. So I'm not conveying sensitive information here. It's obvious, except in official statements of the U.S. government, you rarely see it. The second question was basically why is the U.S. the country that the only country that has used nuclear weapons in wartime and actually used them twice? Why should we lead arms control efforts? And my answer would be partly, well, there's no justice in international affairs. It's basically, we're number one. We're the country that has led in the development of nuclear weapons. And so in one sense, we have more of an obligation to try to get rid of these awful things we helped create. And I do think that our record is better than the record of the Soviet Union, and constantly prodding and pushing for more arms control, certainly than current Russia is comfortable with. And it's particularly painful now to see that even in the meetings required under the terms of the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, the Russians won't engage in the disruption that was created by the pandemic to get Russians back onto sensitive sites in the U.S. and Americans to sensitive sites in Russia. This is highly irresponsible. We're playing games over Ukraine with regard to nuclear weapons. So I'm generally not apologetic about our pushing for nuclear weapons, because I see that as the special obligation we have, partly because we have so many of them and we were the ones to introduce them to the world. So that does seem natural to me, but we should use a little bit more humility and honesty in our rhetoric, given questions like Israel.
Thank you.
Others here?
So when Russia talks about using nuclear weapons in Ukraine, people talk about smaller nuclear bombs. Is that a thing? And how targeted can it be, and how far does stuff from that spread? Wouldn't it spread back into Russia?
Yeah, Lynn raises the question about tactical nuclear weapons, smaller nuclear weapons that Putin implies that he might introduce in the Ukrainian war. I think one of the effects of Putin's threats has been to make people now evaluate some of those early threats as being bluffs. That is, Putin has been openly scolded by the Chinese and the Indians of all countries over this kind of rhetoric. And if one really thinks about how nuclear weapons could be effectively employed in the case of Ukraine, I don't see any scenarios. He uses small nuclear weapons, and by small these days, a small weapon is one that gets maybe 5 times as big as the ones that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That's the idea of small. And we all know that how containable fallout is. It isn't. Chernobyl, located in Ukraine, mostly radiated Belarus to the north, not Ukraine. And any Russian nuclear use in Ukraine could very well radiate large parts of Russia. So it would be extremely reckless policy. And as Putin, is his learning curve so flat that he thinks that even nuclear weapons used against Ukraine would make Ukrainians friendly to Russia and more amenable to Russian desires? I think not. So I think that at some level, Putin has understood that his threats of nuclear use are bluffs, and it would be even more foolish to use them against countries of NATO that have an obligation to defend each other and nuclear arsenals to deploy. So I'm obviously worried about the nuclear weapons in Ukraine, but I don't think that there's an acute threat of Russian use, because I don't think he has any good nuclear options.
Yes, I have a question dealing with Pakistan and India. I already seen that list, lesson for that. Because of what is going on with India and Pakistan in their history from 48 and beyond, it would seem like that would be probably the hottest belt within the world for anything to possibly pop off. How do we feel about those two nations with that excessive power, and they can actually use one themselves?
Neil has raised a very good question about the prospects of nuclear fighting between Pakistan and India, both of which have nuclear weapons. Interesting you would bring that up, because when I was responsible professionally to assess dangers of nuclear warfare, I would say that it was India and Pakistan that were the most likely countries to get into a nuclear war, not the U.S. and Russia, not the British and French or even the North Koreans. It was India and Pakistan, and it was partly because they didn't seem to have the mechanisms and the understanding that even we longer-lived nuclear powers had about the dangers and how you control them and information exchanges and so forth. And there were also some details about doctrine, like the Indians would massively attack Pakistan and they had a conventional superiority over. Well, that would give Pakistan no alternative between surrender and using their own nuclear weapons. So it's a very dangerous dynamic. And scientists have also determined that a full-scale nuclear war between India and Pakistan would result in 3 million people on the planet starving to death because of the fallout and disruption of agriculture. So it would be a horrendous catastrophe. And it is, I think it's fair to say still, even with Ukraine, the most likely way that the planet Earth will see the second use of nuclear weapons.
I have a question that came in on chat, so I will read it here. Who are the congressional champions of reducing nuclear stockpiles? And what is the salience of these issues in both the White House and Congress?
Well, that's a depressing subject. There are people like Senator Markey who have a good record on arms control initiatives. I'm a fan of Congressman Adam Smith as well, chairman of the House former chairman of the House Armed Services Committee. But the general situation with Congress is very depressing. Even things that are sort of no-brainers, like the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty the U.S. signed, the Congress fell far short of a 2/3 vote in order to ratify that treaty. And it's not getting better for the most part. I mean, the military-industrial congressional complex still exists. And it's no coincidence, for example, that I had mentioned my view that we should retire all of the 400 intercontinental ballistic missiles, the Minuteman force that's out mostly in the Great Plains. But I would also note that these silos are in 5 different states. And that means 5 times 2, there are 10 senators who have a personal stake in the jobs and the people in their own constituency. And whether that's accidental or not, it's a reality. And there's an ICBM lobby, and they're not talking about how many nuclear weapons the U.S. needs or what kinds, as much as protecting the facilities in their districts. And of course, when one takes the replacement of the Minuteman by the Sentinel ICBMs, that is, will cost, I think, ultimately more than $1 trillion. That is also engaging far more people than just these 5 states in the business of jobs and business. So I may be too cynical about the non-substantive arguments given for retaining our nuclear weapons in the Congress, but I can't avoid a little cynicism in light of what I regard as the irrationality of this, in light of the competing demands for U.S. funds. The Republicans seem to be talking about cutting back on things like Medicare in order to balance the budget. I haven't heard any Republicans arguing that we really don't need our ICBMs, and we should scratch that extremely expensive replacement effort.
Some more questions? Has Israel signed a treaty of not using nuclear weapons first?
No. Israel has not signed the nuclear non-proliferation treaty, and they are, dare I say, a rogue nation in that regard.
What impact do nuclear arms treaties have, and what impact could they have on reducing the massive costs of these and other investments in war? Funds that could be used, for example, in investments in reducing our other causes of conflict, including climate disruptions, migration, poverty. And I'm going to bring up here also the fact that we have a congressionally funded Institute of Peace, U.S. Institute of Peace. So the idea of the effectiveness of nuclear treaties, if they are effective, could massive costs be reduced and monies going to other places?
Too long.
I've certainly suggested a way that could save significant amounts of money by eliminating our ballistic missile force. I'm not denying that replacing our submarine launched ballistic missiles is enormously expensive, and as are other systems, but we have to start somewhere, and I do think significant savings could be made, and the money could be transferred to the other national security threats, that is the climate change threats that we all face, and they're getting more serious with each passing year. It's from the perspective of a alien civilization looking at the Earth, we are just crazy not doing what we need to do to ensure our chance of survival. And so I think there is significant money, but we also have to be realistic about it. It's not, even if Congress were more enlightened, dramatic change is probably not in the cards in the foreseeable future. One of the things I mentioned is, though, that some of the changes can be made simply by President of the United States changing our nuclear doctrine. Just making a no first use doctrine, for example, would have all kinds of other implications. That is, if we're not retaining the option of firing our nuclear weapons before we're even hit, then why do you need this vulnerable force of 400 ICBMs? It makes no sense.
Okay, question asking if you would be a little bit more specific about North Korea. Mentioned trying to get first reduction in testing, but anything else you might say about nuclear weapons and North Korea?
We don't know whether North Korea today could threaten the continental U.S. with a nuclear strike. North Korea they have a kind of an interesting test program. It's they obviously can construct long-range missiles, but they haven't really provided evidence that they know how to make sure that the warheads re-enter the atmosphere and detonate on target. And I think that my view about the North Koreans is fairly cynical. That is, they don't feel they have to be 100% confident that their nuclear weapons will work, because the U.S. already acts as if they have nuclear weapons, and we're very worried that they will work. And that often is the case. That our inclination is to do worst case analysis. It's very dangerous for the military. Assumptions then prove to be overly optimistic, and so they do the worst case analysis. A good example is, look who's talking about our upcoming war with China. It's the Pentagon, and they're talking about what's going to happen in 5 and 8 years, and the Chinese could have 1,500 warheads on deployed missiles. And you see nothing in these documents about what's the probability of that. How does that match China's demographic crisis with their one child policy, the horrible dysfunction of their COVID measures of shutting down the whole country. There's a very unsophisticated response to all that, and it's partly because those details aren't important to the people who have to deliver the worst case analysis. North Korea, I think, has sensed that. They know that they're already credited with the possibility of attacking South Korea, Japan, and the United States with nuclear weapons, whether or not they actually could or not. But I think it's a fair statement that even with all the billions we've spent on U.S. missile defenses, we're not sure we could even intercept a small North Korean attack with nuclear weapons. Who knows? But it's also worth saying that why in the world would North Korea ever use a nuclear weapon and be the first to use it? I mean, that makes no sense, even if the U.S. had no nuclear weapons. If the U.S. were attacked with nuclear weapons, North Korea would cease to exist as a political entity. Everyone knows that. It's common sense. And so why in the world would the North Koreans ever use a nuclear weapon? I cannot fathom it.
Could I comment on that, please? Just, that was my question. Just one quick follow-up. For the last 50 years or so, the rational actor, this is Carl, by the rational actor has been the basis for a lot of nuclear disarmament activities. Do you think that does apply in the case of North Korea? It would seem that of all the various current owners, and I say 9 or 10 of them, whether admitted or not, of nuclear weapons, the one where the rational actor might not apply is North Korea. And everything you just said is why would they do that, yada, yada, yada. But in fact, they are rapidly developing their rocket technology, and no one else is really doing that to that extent. And just wanted to follow up.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. My own theory is that there are no irrational actors, no matter how heinous the dictator. Any well-established dictator has to have a certain degree of rationality in order to avoid assassination and being overthrown. And I think that the North Koreans have shown, as crazy as their policies seem to be and their rhetoric seems to be, the family rule over the country seems to be fairly solid, and they have that degree of rationality. They know what kind of threats they need to make to avoid being attacked. And I think the U.S. is a pretty high bar. I don't see much reasonable speculation about the U.S. invasion of North Korea to as a preventive war or preemption. You do see some things about it, but I don't think we're really considering that. And it's partly because we think that North Koreans, that is one thing that would cause them to use nuclear weapons or to do something drastic or crazy if we attack them. Well, from their point of view, that's very important if they can prevent an attack through their rhetoric and development of nuclear weapons. So I see some rationality there, even though it's a very odious regime. I think it's the kind of regime that would actually see there would be a potential benefit in promising not to test nuclear weapons. They already demonstrated they know how to make nuclear weapons explode. If they could get something valuable from signing the CTBT, I don't see that as being totally out of the picture.
We are almost out of time, and so I'm going to ask Greg to read 3 questions that came in and choose what he's going to answer, knowing how short we are for time. But our esteemed speaker is someone that we can contact directly ourselves any other time. So let's take advantage of that and have you be able to follow up on some of these things later. 3 tough questions, and I may be grateful that he doesn't have a lot of time.
Yeah, there's one. What were the circumstances that led Latin America to the remarkable Treaty of Tlatelolco?
And continue on. Read the questions.
Okay. Is there any politically acceptable way to separate the issue of the safety of our nuclear deterrent, that is, of our silos deteriorating over time from other efforts to modernize or otherwise make our deterrent more credible. And any guess about how long the war on Ukraine will be active or will end? Well, I'll do the easy one first. No, I have no idea. I would speculate that there's not going to be an early end to the war. And I've heard a lot of speculation about the use of main battle tanks. And I think I just note the irony of German Leopard 2 tanks being a significant factor for a good outcome in establishing Ukrainian independence and territorial integrity. And the world has changed in many significant ways since World War II.
And maybe the last comment.
Yeah, the Treaty of Tlatelolco, I'm not an expert on the treaty, but that basically involves the countries of South America forswearing nuclear weapons, which is another good thing. That's one thing that we don't any longer worry about South America. We once had significant proliferation concerns about Brazil and some about Argentina. We were definitely making arsenal progress in Latin America. And in terms of nuclear safety, I would just say that I'm fairly impressed at the efforts taken to make sure that things do work the way they're supposed to work. I'm more confident in our own military doing that than some of the other countries who hold nuclear weapons. I would just end at that.
Okay, and with that, let's all thank Greg for